Hello, this is Aaron, and welcome back to the podcast. I hope everyone had a great weekend. This week, I'm returning to something I had mentioned several months ago that some of you said you were interested in, so I added it to my list of ideas, and I decided to bring it forward to this week, and that is the case against Bill Hybels. Bill Hybels was the founding pastor of Willow Creek Church in suburban Chicago, one of the biggest churches in the entire country, a huge name pastor, someone who essentially pioneered the seeker-sensitive movement as we know it. He was slated to retire, and shortly before his retirement, several women made accusations of sexual harassment and abuse against him, and he was forced out early. So I want to go take a look at those. But before I do that, I want to remind us that we're doing a sponsor for the month of February on the podcast, and that sponsor is Gold River Trading Company. Gold River Trading Company is a specialty tea company. It is the official tea of the American frontier. Obviously, we don't grow the tea in the United States because we're not a tea-producing country, but it is blended and packaged in the United States. It's high-quality, flavorful tea that makes a great alternative to the woke beverage companies that hate you. It's great stuff. I've been drinking it. You can buy some at goldriverco.com. That's goldriverco.com. And if you use discount code RENN10, you will get 10% off your order. That's RENN10 for 10% off your order. So back to the podcast this week. The case against Bill Hybels. And I want to be clear that I am not going to claim or make an argument that Bill Hybels is actually innocent. I don't know what happened. I haven't made an accusation against him. I haven't looked into the accusations against him. All I want to do is look at what we've been told about him and look at this, because the case against Hybels is actually quite weak, as you will see. And I thought about this when something was printed in a New York Times article that really made me think. Why do I say these accusations are a bit weak? Well, one is that Hybels has flatly denied the allegations. I have never seen him say, "Oh, I'm sorry if anything I did hurt you," or even like a generic apology like that. I've seen him say, "Yeah, I realize in retrospect, I put myself into situations I shouldn't have put myself into." Maybe he's just referring to he allowed himself to be alone with some women, as opposed to anything he actually did wrong. But so far as I know, he's always flatly denied the allegations. Secondly, the allegations that I've seen all seem to date from far into the past, the 80s and the 90s. There don't seem to be a lot of contemporaneous accusations being made against him. I wasn't even able to really dig up much. Now, again, not everything is precisely dated here. There may have been some newer ones, but certainly the most salacious accusations, the ones that were written about in the New York Times, are ones that date back to the 1980s. This is a pattern that we see in a number of these accusations. You could think of Christine Blasey Ford's accusations against Brett Kavanaugh, for example, during the Supreme Court nomination, in which she raised allegations from decades prior. It's not unusual in these situations for the alleged events to be a decade or more old. And I'm actually going to talk about a very specific example of that towards the end of the podcast, because some very interesting things came out of that one. So again, it doesn't prove anything, but I do find it interesting. So I want to just hone in on two particular things. I'm not going to try to litigate this whole thing. I'm just going to hone in on two particular things. One is the investigation that was done by this committee retained by Willow Creek to investigate. They put out a 17-page report that received tremendous press as being advertised as having validated these accusations. And secondly, I'm going to look at this big New York Times piece that was about this one woman who claimed that she was forced to have oral sex with him in the 80s and that. And I'm going to put links to both of these in the show notes if you want to go read them for yourself. The report that was published by the investigating committee I thought was really interesting. For one thing, remarkably little specificity as to what it is Hybels was actually accused of doing. Which I think is interesting. And it's also interesting that in this report, what you will discover is that all they did was interview people. They didn't look at any documents. They didn't say that they looked at any documents at any rate. It was all about conducting interviews with accusers, interviews with Hybels, interviews with other people. This is a committee that sat down and interviewed people and just listened to what they had to say. It does make one little thing about emails, which I will read to you. It says the IAG, which I think may stand for Independent Accountability Group, this is the committee, engaged an external professional IT forensics company to examine the WCCC email system and associated data. However, no related email content was recoverable. This is a little obscure. The fact that they talk about no emails being recoverable and a forensics company invites us to think that they're looking into people who may have scrubbed or deleted emails or hard drives in an attempt to cover something up. I have not heard anything of that nature. It just seems to me that maybe they went looking for emails and they didn't find any, which, to be fair, for many of these allegations, there wouldn't be any emails because from the 80s and 90s, there probably wasn't email in the 80s, certainly. And even if there were some emails at these times, nobody keeps backups of emails from that far in the past. But that was a little bit of an interesting statement that I think is inviting us to draw some conclusions about a cover-up without actually saying so. But I would be interested in knowing more about the charter of that. But otherwise, there doesn't seem to have been any investigation of documentation or places and events, but it was more a committee that just listened to people and drew conclusions from it. And here's what they said in the conclusions. I'm not going to read the whole thing. I'm just going to read a couple key sentences. Point 1, allegations of sexually inappropriate words and actions by Bill Hybels in the context of his ministry and leadership of Willow Creek Community Church and the Willow Creek Association are credible. Number 2, the credibility of the allegations is not based on any one accusation or accuser, but on the collective testimony and context of the allegations. Note that they only say the allegations are credible. They don't say that they're true or that they're proven in any way. They just say that they're credible. So somebody who sat down and told us that she was abused may well be very credible, but that doesn't mean the allegations are true. It just means that this person is telling us a story that on its face seems reasonable, realistic, and worthy of investigation. You might want to refer that to the police and let them do a proper investigation to determine what may have actually happened. It also sounds like, again, they don't tell us exactly what caused them to conclude everything was credible, but they also say it wasn't just one person that caused us that, it was the context. And so, I think we're being invited to suggest it's the fact that multiple women accused him of these things that makes it more credible. That maybe if it had just been one person that said something, they may have been credible. They may not have viewed it as credible because it doesn't seem like Bill, but because there are these multiple accusers that come forward, maybe they're just more credible. Again, we don't know for sure, but that is my best interpretation of what they are saying. And so this thing basically is a 17-page report by a committee that interviewed some people and said, we think this is credible. That's really all they said. This was treated as if they'd found smoking gun evidence that he did something wrong in the press. To me, this reads more like an indictment than a verdict. They really didn't substantiate anything in any way or go into any specificity. And if you look at the people that composed this committee, I don't think it was mostly people that you would consider world-class investigators either. Not to say they were bad people. They looked like credible people. I can't remember everybody who was on it. But, this was not a, FBI investigation. or something like that. But this was one of the things that was sort of treated as if, oh, see, they did this investigation, they found these things were credible, so he's guilty. In fact, they seem to have found not all that much, and it seems to have been based almost exclusively on testimonies making accusations. Secondly is this New York Times article about a woman who'd worked for Willow Creek in the 1980s, and it actually lived with the Hybels family for a period of time. Now, you might say, wow, that was kind of unwise to have a female staff member living with you. I would agree. And maybe that's what he's referring to when he talks about some of these things. You may recall that MarkDriscoll also had pastoral staff living in his basement or in a basement apartment with him, which, again, it sounds cool. They bring people on staff. They need a place to live. Let them stay with the pastor. But it goes to show that sometimes, trying to do a good deed is not the right move, particularly when you were in a position of authority in an organization, and particularly when you're a man and involves someone of the opposite sex, even if you are, married and they're living with your family, because inevitably there are going to be times when you're alone with this person. Right? The Billy Graham rule or the Mike Pence rule, these things are actually smart for a reason. So I would say this was actually not a very good move by him. But here's the article. It's titled, "He's a Superstar Pastor. She worked for him and says he groped her repeatedly. Bill Hybels built an iconic evangelical church outside Chicago. A former assistant says that in the 1980s, he sexually harassed her." So this person says that he groped her and that they had oral sex kind of under pressure from him once. And one of the things that they have in there is a photograph of a note. Bill Hybels apparently gave her several handwritten notes, and she has saved these over the years. And so she's someone who's been a documentation saver. I think that's one of the things I would take away from this piece. She saved pieces of documentation. So she had this note. She also had this exit plan that they had sketched out for her. But she had this note. And so I will read a little bit of that. Mrs. Baranowski kept handwritten notes she received from Bill Hybels. In one, Mr. Hybels praised her work and said, "I am praying that your new small group at church will be a source of much happiness and strength in your life." Then he added, "P.S. Plus, you are a knockout." And again, they've got a picture of that note. And I would say maybe he should not have made some comment about her appearance in that note. However, keep in mind, this is the 1980s. The standards of the 1980s were quite different than the standards of even the 90s. The sexual harassment revolution had really not even fully been present in the 1980s. It was really a lot in the 90s where that stuff started coming out, as I recall, Clinton, etc. So I would tell you, should he have put that in there? No. Is that anything remotely like what the accusations were? No. But they had it, and they actually have a picture of this article in the New York Times. Later, they have something else in the article, and I just want to read this passage for you. "His attitude towards her began to change," she said. "She moved out of the house after 2 years. In the office, he began to suspect she was incompetent and unstable. He berated her at work in front of others. She grew depressed and poured out her feelings to God, filling 20 spiral-bound journals. On May 11th, 1989, she wrote, 'I feel like an abused wife.' She feared she would be forced to stand in front of the congregation and confess, like the other employees who were fired. She was relocated to work in a converted coat closet." This is the piece that really, really, got my little spidey sense tinkling. Here's someone who filled 20 spiral-bound notebooks, 20 spiral-bound notebooks with contemporaneous journal entries. And I think it's reasonable to conclude that none of those journal entries were incriminating about Bill Hybels. Because if they were, the New York Times would have told us what was in them. And again, maybe they were destroyed. Again, they don't say, but it's interesting that there are 20 spiral-bound notebooks full of basically diary or journal entries, and yet we don't see any of them here. We have a note in which Bill Hybels made, a sort of inappropriate but not especially bad and certainly not out of line for the periods of the time comment. That's the closest thing to a smoking gun we have, even though she saved all this documentation and she took all these notebooks. It's remarkable that nowhere in any of that documentation could they find much of anything that was negative about Bill Hybels, which is truly remarkable, because I think about if people went over all our documentations that we wrote, they could surely find something, right? Show me the man and I'll show you the crime, as they say. But here we have someone who clearly has saved a bunch of documents for multiple decades, and yet really very little, certainly nothing that comports with these accusations that she's making. Again, I'm not saying that they're not true, or that, I'm arguing that he's actually innocent. I'm just saying that the evidence is really not there. It's an accusation, and there's a lot of documentation existing, but this documentation does not seem to really support the accusations. And I think that this is known by some journalists as well. I look a lot at Julie Roys. If you know Julie Roys, she's a Christian journalist. She's written a lot about abuse. She has a talk show and she writes for other publications. She's got a blog. And she's the one who wrote a huge article about James McDonald, another suburban Chicago megachurch pastor, for World Magazine, which really destroyed his ministry. And she basically had all the receipts, as they say. I've got the receipts. She had them. And it was a very thorough job that she did. And weirdly, he even sued her, and all that was dropped because it was just quality journalism. And I talk a lot about genre and genre. So again, I always say podcast is talk radio genre. This is a talk radio show. When I write for First Things Magazine print edition, which I did with my 3 Worlds of Evangelicalism, that's a different genre. That is me doing a piece of its opinion, but it's a long-form analysis, and it needs to be done to a higher level of rigor and different standards. The genre matters. So Julie Roys goes to World Magazine, which is a news magazine. It's not even an opinion magazine. Yes, they do some opinion. And by the way, they've always done opinion. This opinion section that they have may be new, but they've always had opinions and columnists. She's in there. I don't know if World does this. Many magazines fact check. So when you go to a magazine, it has to be done at a certain level of journalistic rigor as a reported story in order for that to go to press. And the editor's going to make sure that happens. And so she went there. And if you look carefully at her reporting on Bill Hybels, I never saw her actually do a piece of journalism like that on Bill Hybels. She talked a lot about him. She tweeted about him. And she had accusers of Bill Hybels on her radio show where, because it's a talk radio show, she's able to just let them make accusations and give their side of the story, because that's what you do when you have a guest on your show. And, she does that, but she doesn't have the receipts. She doesn't have the goods. I think Julie Roys understands that the actual case against Bill Hybels is pretty weak, and that there's not a lot of actual evidence against him that would suggest that, wow, this guy is guilty. Again, doesn't mean that he's innocent, particularly when there's things long ago. There may not be a lot of evidence. Nevertheless, the case against him isn't all that strong. It's mostly just accusations. And as with this independent investigative report that they concluded, I think a lot of the credibility of these accusations comes from the fact that there are multiple accusers. And we'll come to that in a minute. I want to give you a lens to think about the Bill Hybels thing in a slightly different way. And this is something I've noticed sometimes happens to people. I call it the King Lear lens. Here's a guy who was sort of at the end of his career, and he's getting ready to retire, and he wants to divide up his kingdom among different people. So he appointed 2 successors, and he's getting everything, arranged. and he's getting ready to step away. And this is when all these accusations come out. And it's just an interesting timing in a lot of ways that it came out. And a lot of these accusations against these men, seem to be coming out at times where they're in the twilight of their careers, kind of well past their prime in terms of, power and influence. And, I saw this about Mark Driscoll. Mark Driscoll, if you look at even the pictures of Mark Driscoll, he was trying to transition to a little bit of a kinder, gentler figure right about the time all this stuff started coming out. And it just seemed to me, as I started reading and listening to all the things that were coming out about Mark Driscoll, that there are people that had been nursing grudges against him for years, who were just waiting for their opportunity to get back at him. And by the way, some of them had good reasons to have grudges. Okay? So let's be clear, he did some bad things, but it's like when this stuff started coming out, then everybody's there. So Hybels, I think, at this transition point where he's retiring, he's stepping back, he's passing it on, this seems to be a period in men's careers at which they are vulnerable to people who've been nursing grudges for a long time to come out and take shots at them because they're more vulnerable, they're less powerful, etc. Obviously, King Lear dividing up his kingdom did not go so well. But I think that's just a lens, a way of looking at things that you should also look at when you start reading about stories or scandals or things of that nature. Where in the life cycle of this person's career are they? Are they at the end? Are they transitioning out? Are they trying to pass on their kingdom to someone else? That's when things often get a little sideways. Again, it doesn't tell us anything at all about the guilt or innocence of the person, but it situates it within the context of a particular career. And I do think it's interesting, the timing of when these things come out. Now, I want to conclude by telling you about another case that strikes me as being somewhat similar to that of Bill Hybels. And it was one from a few years ago of a Canadian gentleman by the name of Jian Ghomeshi. Now, Jian Ghomeshi was an announcer for the Canadian Broadcasting Company radio network. So this would be like someone being on the BBC in England. He's with the CBC in Canada. So he's working for the state broadcaster. He is a major mainstream figure. And several women came forward and accused him, in essence, of rape, that he had sexually assaulted them, choked them, forced himself on them, etc. So he was fired, and in fact, he was actually charged with multiple accounts of sexual assault and put on trial. And again, there were multiple accusers with credible stories, etc. But unbeknownst to these women, Jian Ghomeshi had saved, it appears to be, every single email they'd ever sent him going back a decade or more. Now, Jian Ghomeshi appears to be into some kinky sex that I won't talk about here, so he may have had good reason to think, I better take some steps to protect myself in case some of these relationships go south. But for whatever reason, he did. And so when he was put on trial, he was able to trot out these emails that showed things in a very different light. So, for example, one of the women had several sexually explicit emails she had sent him after the supposed rape, including one from just a few hours later that said, "You kicked my ass last night, and that makes me want to F your brains out." Another woman had said to the police, "I had no contact or communication with Ghomeshi after the rape had occurred," but he brought forth emails that said, in fact, she had been in contact with him, and she'd even sent pictures of herself in a bikini to him that she had not done. And then a third woman had to admit that she had not told police that she had had consensual sex with Ghomeshi after he supposedly had raped her. It also came out, and again, part of the credibility came from the fact that there were multiple of these accusers. It also came out that before they had gone to the police, at least two of these women had texted each other 5,000 times. So they weren't truly independent. They were people who were sort of comparing notes and, dare I say, possibly getting their story straight before they went to the police and leveled all of these accusations. And so what we see is basically these women lied to the police, lied at trial, and as a result, Ghomeshi was found not guilty. When the accusers were demonstrated through documentary evidence to have lied, and when they were demonstrated through documentary evidence to have been texting, etc., coordinating prior to going public and making these accusations and going to the police, it made it so that there was not possible to say beyond a reasonable doubt that he had done it. And here's the key. If Ghomeshi had not saved those emails, he would be rotting away in prison right now because these accusations are very powerful. By the way, we've seen this. How many black men have we seen released after decades of prison when DNA evidence, finally our DNA testing got so much better that these samples from the early 90s can be tested and discovered, oh, by the way, they were physically impossible that they were the rapist. They'd been accused of rape, sentenced to decades in prison, spent a very long time in prison, and now DNA has proved conclusively that they didn't do it. Maybe credible accusations, and that was enough to put them away. And that's the truth. This is what happened to Hybels. They made credible accusations, and if you're in a man accused of a crime of a sexual nature, you're basically going to be presumed guilty when the accusation's made unless you can prove yourself innocent. Again, doesn't mean that Bill Hybels is innocent, but if we look at our legal standard of, beyond a reasonable doubt, there's no way this guy could ever be put on trial. If we look at even our civil standards of a preponderance of the evidence, I don't think there's any way you could rule in his favor in a civil case because there doesn't seem to be much evidence at all beyond simply the accusations that were made against him. And so I think that there's probably a whole lot of stuff that we don't know about. And again, the thing that really gets me is the person who accused him of the worst things actually kept a tremendous amount of contemporaneous documentation, including handwritten notes of photographs of which are in the New York Times. Yet, none of that really substantiates any of the allegations. So I would just say the case against Bill Hybels is pretty weak. He's always denied it. It involves stuff that happened, decades previously and at the end of his career. And so I would have to say the case against Bill Hybels is remarkably weak. It's very different than the sorts of things that were leveled against James McDonald, which were highly substantiated, or the kinds of accusations that were made against Mark Driscoll, which were tremendously substantiated, again, often by Driscoll himself on camera, or by documents or different things that people had. There was a lot of evidence. He did plagiarize all these issues, right? He did pay people to be on the New York Times. We could probably go pull the contract. We can see the disbursements. There's real evidence there. The Hybels thing is an incredibly, incredibly weak case that, based on everything I have read, maybe something came out that I'm not aware of in the interim, but for certainly some time after that, I'm like, wow, there doesn't seem to be any actual, tangible, real evidence against Bill Hybels. Because a couple of you had said that, I wanted to do a podcast just talking about it, and that may give you a different perspective on the Hybels one, which to me is different from some of these other ones that seem to be much, much more substantiated, much more real, etc. So thank you for listening, and I will talk to you again next week.